Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Emily, and I'm here with my co-host, Jen.
Morning, everyone. We have a great guest on for this afternoon. We'll be having a discussion with our Director of Business Development here at SN, Kevin Hebblethwaite. And Kevin brings a really interesting background and perspective. His time spent in AEC has been focused in marketing and business development, but he really has a well-rounded kind of understanding and approach to the business as a whole, which we feel is so important for those emerging leaders as they're growing and developing their careers. So Kevin, would love to hear kind of from you early in your career, when you're just kind of starting out, when you realized how important it was to have that broad perspective of the business.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I have always thought that regardless of whatever your role, it's really important to understand other parts of the company or the firm you're working for. A little bit of a background. I cut my teeth on IT things before I got to the AEC world, which was about going to be 25 years ago before we know it. But the transitioning from IT into engineering was actually not that big of a leap, because obviously it's a technical field. But I'd realized that in the IT world, there's this nice mix of selling people, the services that do the work, and the boxes, the gear, the servers, and all of that. And I had really kind of, I guess for lack of a better description, I'd grown tired of selling the boxes. And I had this interest in professional services, and it just kind of turned out like most of us in marketing and BD, we fell into the AEC industry. But not too long after that, back to your question, I have a business background, business administration degree. I found myself looking for the connections between sort of the textbook knowledge that you would get in a college program, business program, and the vocabulary that we use every day in A&E firms. And at first it was sort of like, well, what are you talking about? And what does that mean? But after some good probing questions and some good dialogue with the financial people, with the project management people, started to connect those dots pretty quickly. And as a matter of fact, determined that, it's kind of all the same stuff with just a slightly different flair. So that's how I got into the dialogue with people in other functions, and sort of understanding the importance.
Yeah. And I think that's so interesting because each business does kind of talk about the business side of things a little bit differently, right? I came from consumer packaged goods, like large Fortune 500. And as an engineer, I was such a small part of the business, right? Like we were in charge of executing their capital strategy and whatnot, but driving sales and everything was a whole separate function. But I think I realized, right, when I was going into capital, reviews and proposing a construction project, a new manufacturing facility, et cetera, there was this whole business case for why that needed to happen, right? What was the return on investment? How many years did they expect to see that return and whatnot? So it takes some time as a technical person, I think, to learn that lingo. But the more you're exposed to it, you see how beneficial it is to be able to speak that common language.
Totally agree. And I would always try to do the reverse as well. If I felt like I had something to learn from them, I would look for every opportunity to help them understand a little bit about the marketing and BD role. Usually it's safe to say that most technical professions don't have a whole lot of business education, as we mentioned. And that can go many different directions, from strategic planning all the way to how do you close a deal or whatever may be in between. But if it's a nice exchange where each side is interested in learning a little bit more about what the other has, it was always very productive. Never had really anyone who was opposed to the conversation and the learning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Emily, I know you have experienced that, right, in AEC firms, being that kind of dedicated marketer, BD professional wanting to collaborate with engineers and kind of potentially needing to educate them a little bit. That's how I felt. I felt like I needed education.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know all of the ins and outs of what an engineer does every day, just like they don't know what I do every day as a marketer. So, like you, Jen, and we've mentioned a couple of times on here, I also have a background before entering into the AEC industry in Fortune 500, worked in retail on a buying team, and um, was exposed to really amazing leaders at the company I worked at that really encouraged me to go shadow and go learn about different roles as I'm growing my career and decide the path that I want to take. I became really interested in marketing and product marketing specifically when I was in retail, but like you were talking about, Kevin, kind of fell into the AEC industry and got a job as a marketer, solo team completely at a small architecture firm. And then joined a national design firm, full service, and was on more of a team. But as a team within marketing, I really learned. So when I was just the solo marketer at the small architecture firm, I had to learn what everyone did because I had to wear a lot of different hats in that role. And I think a lot of marketing people probably have that experience as well when they're the solo marketing team. And then, you know, being on a larger team, you're working on pursuits and proposals. And the advantage to that is you do get to work with all of the technical professionals within the firm and have some exposure. And you're putting together how people, you know, how your team is talking about building a project. But I absolutely, that exposure to the different sides of the business has been key. You also have to be interested and ask the right questions too as you go along.
For sure. Well, if you really trace the history of this profession, if you will, the non-technical marketing and BD profession in the technical professions all the way back to its origin, it's different for different industries. But as far as architects and engineers go, you'll find yourself in the very early 1970s when a bunch of them found themselves together, maybe at a bar, the rumor goes, realizing they all had the same problem. And they needed to figure this out. So I guess you could argue it's a relatively new profession, but yeah, as you mentioned, we all end up wearing a lot of different hats in that case. But it's everybody had to figure that out together, and the recognition that it's not something that just sort of automatically happens. You have to figure out how to get the word out, get the brand out. Even if you're a single soul designer, a company of one. I remember, gosh, this was a long time ago, but somebody said, "Well, what do you?" Asking another BD person, well, what do you all do? What's your job? I said, well, I have three jobs actually: get the project, get the project, and get the project, and then everything else kind of flows from there. So that was one of the things, kind of back to the original question. I would find some great common ground in, especially talking with financial people, those responsible for payroll and everything else, financial and HR. But the project management, project leadership folks, they have a wonderful appreciation of anybody who will help them get the project, and get the project. Lovely common ground right there.
Yeah. And I feel like some engineers, at least I felt this way previously, is like it can be a little intimidating to quote unquote sell, right? So it's amazing if you can leverage, right, that internal team you have to kind of build that case and put out your kind of value proposition into the marketplace. But I think there are simple ways that you can look at it from an engineer's perspective of what selling is and what the benefit is you're bringing, right? You're just trying to add value for your client, right? How can you help them execute their strategy, be a partner, be that valued advisor? And we say it internally here, like selling can just be like, hey, this is a great project as you're wrapping up, and say anything coming up that we can potentially assist you with in the future. We'd love to be there and partner again, right? Like that's selling to some extent. So I think we shouldn't be scared of it as engineers, but it is amazing when we can leverage that internal team to help us with those conversations too.
Sure. And you brought up a great point about, well, who are we selling to? And in your example, you're talking to an existing client.
Yeah.
And, most of us do the math with somewhere around high 70, 80% of the work that we're doing is with clients we already know. So that's definitely a path you can go down. I also like helping unpack uh, the sensitive sales topic that we're talking about here, where most likely a particular designer, engineer, architect, professional is already working on some things that they have a story about. They can talk about the challenges they're overcoming, how they did it, how they intend to do it. And so, in my words, I'd say a lot of the sales stuff we have to do is just solidifying a story and sharing it with a few other people. Sometimes that's a direct conversation. Other times you're trying to encourage some of those clients to talk to their associates and friends out in the marketplace about the work that you're doing. So yeah, love those examples.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it goes back to that having different perspectives at the table and having that exposure to the different perspectives. Because I think as a marketer, or even as someone from a different age demographic or background professionally, we all can bring those different ideas like, hey, well, have you thought about it this way? My past role, we really hit on sales hard, and kind of talking through some of those things and bringing those different perspectives and asking and engaging in those conversations, asking questions. Like, one of the main things that I've had to overcome as being a young professional is really not being afraid to ask questions if I don't understand something, because a lot of times that brings out some really critical information that might have been overlooked by everyone that sort of technically knows what they're talking about.
I love that. And while I'm not sure if we'll cover all of the situations on this episode, but you could do, I'm sure, many episodes on what some of those really important probing questions are. I'll give you another example. I had thought a little bit about this before we did the episode today, but think about things a little more intense, like owners' transition plans, even the ones that you should be planning for. I think marketers have a great sort of ability to have situational awareness. And sometimes, that you may get an answer like, hey, you have no business asking me about that. Most of us work for really nice people, really smart, nice people. But if you get the chance to help dive in a little bit deeper and kind of and really do it from a place of, no, I care. I'm working here too. And whether it's about ownership or strategic planning, anything that's, perhaps a quote, a little bit outside of your lane, if you have that interest in asking the questions that are a little more probing and a little deeper, I will tell you the likelihood is high that if you're doing it from the right place, you'll probably get invited to solve the problem in one way or another. I'll give you a really simple example, because the ownership transition was kind of a really deep, intense one. But if you notice, if you hear everybody talking about, well, we can never get our money, it takes 120 days to get our bills paid. I don't know that that's on the marketer's job to solve it. However, everybody's at stake if the money's not coming in fast enough. So if you find ways to work on that client experience that shortens that cycle, oh, they're not paying because they just don't understand our invoices. They will pay it quickly if they understand them better. And again, that might not be your day job, but look for those little places along the way where you understand a little bit more about what's going on, and then just offer a couple of suggestions. And guess what? Money's coming in faster all of a sudden, or there's less resistance to pay. All kinds of examples in between.
Yeah, yeah. And I love how you said, right, looking for opportunities in other places, or not saying no to opportunities when they come your way. I think that's a great perspective for young emerging leaders to have, is to say, okay, if someone taps me on the shoulder and says, hey, do you want to work on this project? I know it's outside your lane, but it could be a great growth opportunity. Being willing to accept kind of assignments and challenges that may not be quote unquote a marketing, professional's job or a technical professional's job. To your point, Emily, you bring kind of a different viewpoint, a different lens at looking at a problem when it's something you don't tackle every day, day in and day out. So I loved your comment there about that, Kevin.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as a young leader or a young professional, I mean, really early on in my career, I learned to raise my hand for opportunities or to ask to sit at the table or just sit in on a meeting. And I know we're all up against, utilization rates and things like that, obviously being in a professional services industry, but I think there's so much value that comes in sitting there and learning what leaders talk about and the way that they solve problems and the way they talk about marketing, and then being able to maybe tell them and offer some insight on like, hey, well, actually in marketing, or whatever role or that you sit in or project that you're on, provide some feedback, and obviously not just talking just to talk and throwing in things, but really, like you said, Kevin, intentionally asking deeper questions or providing insights that maybe those at the table currently didn't think about.
Yeah, and you mentioned, deadlines, and especially in marketing. I mean, if we have anything to do with proposals, deadlines are a thing. If we have anything to do with delivery and operations, obviously, and projects, deadlines are a thing. So back on that topic of the situational awareness, I think another big one is let's be honest with ourselves. The day before the thing is due, whatever it is, may not be the best time to explore some nice questions that aren't a part of my job description. I mean, it might go well, but realistically, I would say let's look for that breathing room. Maybe it's if we're in a physical office together, it's 10 minutes here and there where we're taking a break, or it's a virtual coffee if we're people who interact with each other virtually across the country. But just recognize we need a little breathing room to explore this. Again, we're doing it from a place that is a healthy curiosity. We're not just trying to fill up calendars more. I really want to understand more about this. Or if somebody asks you about something in your job, I would treat that very respectfully, even when it is right before the deadline, and say, I'm really glad you're asking about what goes on in my world. Can we get 10 minutes, like in 2 days, after we turn in this $500,000 proposal? And obviously, you're going to get the respect of accepting that curiosity and sharing. And the more you can do it, I made a note about the more you have that exchange around common ground, like common goals, common objectives, it probably means you've got a good strategy in place and everybody's realizing what their own contributions bring to the goals in your plan, whether it's an annual thing or a broader 3 to 5 year kind of strategic plan.
Yeah.
So Kevin, if you were to give just like a first step, a most important step to a young emerging leader as they're kind of developing further in their career and maybe taking on leadership responsibilities, what would you tell them?
Well, that's a good question. I'm kind of thinking about it from two angles. If we kind of go back to the original topic here and we say whether you're BD, marketing, I mean, I could even argue that finance and HR, we've got plenty of non-technically credentialed people working in technical firms. But focusing on BD and marketing, I'd say if you're one of those, you don't have a PE, you're not a licensed architect, surveyor, et cetera, I would say start from a place of curiosity. You've got to understand what is the value that client is paying for. What's the product? What's the deliverable? Start there and come from a place of curiosity. That might mean that you need to put your job and what you do secondary. But if you very quickly start to help that other person understand why is it that you actually have a project to put your time against? Where did that come from? What was the genesis there? So there's one angle as the non-technically credentialed person. But then the young professional who is just out of engineering school or is coming into a firm, it's kind of, yeah, do your job, get onto a project and do the assignments that you have, but start to unpack that question where we came from on the other angle, which is how did it show up in the first place? And especially if you feel like, as that young technical professional, hey, I like understanding how these things come out of the blue, or I like understanding how dialogue with clients or prospects about challenges they may be facing. And oh, by the way, here's how we solved that problem the last 5 times it came up. Or that's where it's like, yeah, dive into that. And I will say pretty quickly that if you get into the process as a young technical professional of landing new work, you probably have a pretty safe career track ahead of you, because somebody has to find it. And again, what's your job? It's get the project, get the project, get the project. So if you want to be a part of that, it is not exclusive to technical people. They must be involved in that process. So kind of depending on where you come from, that's what I would look at.
Yeah. I think that curiosity is so important too. And, extend to your point, it extends beyond, BD and sales, right? If you have that curiosity around maybe finance or HR and how we best support our team members and get them the resources they need, look to kind of, pour some energy into that, see if you can shadow with some HR professionals or, be a part of some of the strategic planning from a finance perspective. So there are so many ways, I think, for technical and non-technical folks to get that cross-functional perspective of the business.
I would say definitely these days. I know the emphasis today was on BD and marketing, but you might as well learn about recruiting while you're at it, because everybody has that challenge, of course.
Yeah. And Emily, we always talk, related to employer brand. It's like your brand within the marketplace based on your, as an employer, right? How are client or how are prospective employees finding you? What is the story they hear about your firm, in social media, et cetera? That can be shared with every single employee in a company, right? How I engage with our social media and the stories I tell about Stambaugh Ness build that employer brand and is a huge part of that recruiting effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is just that, cross collaboration, and through those projects where you can cross collaborate with different areas of the business, you learn so much about what they do and the value they bring. And that is absolutely something to look for an opportunity to pursue anytime we can.
Yeah, and to celebrate, right? The more we get to connect with one another, I think builds that trust and can build that longevity for the organization. So,
yeah.
Cool.
I agree. I think it's pretty obvious right off the bat when we have those overlaps and we all realize this was a win for everyone. It's probably because we read the plan and we all brought good efforts to it. Totally agree.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great conversation. And some really great insights, I think, for emerging leaders to take away. Make sure you're approaching everything with curiosity, right? Try to understand all those different touch points you have with internal team members, be it marketing, finance, HR. How can you make their job easier? How can you be a good partner? Approach it with curiosity. So I think that was a great conversation, and we will definitely look to have you on in the future. I know you said you've got a ton of stories, and we would love to dig into those. So thank you so much.
Love what you are doing with the podcast. Thank you so much for having me.
Yep. We'll see / join all of our listeners in our next episode. Thanks so much.